1842. A British warship anchored off the Chinese coast. Inside a cabin, Chinese officials sign a treaty at gunpoint. They're handing over Hong Kong, paying millions in silver, opening ports to foreign trade they never wanted. But here's what the British officers didn't notice. The Chinese delegation wasn't just signing. They were studying. The ships, the cannons, the manufacturing that made Britain unstoppable. They were asking themselves one question. How did a tiny island nation humiliate an empire of 400 million people? The answer was brutally simple. Industrial power, economic strength, manufacturing capability. China learned that lesson, and they never forgot it. Here's what your economics textbooks won't tell you. China becoming the factory of the world wasn't desperation. It wasn't cheap labor looking for work. It was strategy. Calculated, patient, multi-generational strategy, born directly from 110 years of humiliation. You watched this happen. When Nixon went to China in 1972, it was rice paddies and bicycles. When China joined the WTO in 2001, experts said they'd assemble sneakers forever. Now, they build your phones, your cars, your medical equipment, your semiconductors, everything. That transformation, the one you witnessed in your lifetime, started with a lesson learned at gunpoint in 1842. Let me show you how deep this goes. Before the Opium Wars, China was the world's largest economy. Not by a little, by a lot. In 1820, China produced roughly 33% of global GDP. A third of everything made on Earth came from China. But here's what China didn't have: industrial manufacturing. Britain did. Britain had factories churning out textiles, steel, weapons, and most importantly, warships with cannons that could level any coastal city. When Britain wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, they had a problem. China didn't want anything Britain made. So silver flowed out of Britain into China, year after year. The trade deficit was killing them. Britain's solution? Opium. Grown in India, smuggled into China. Create millions of addicts, reverse the silver flow, and if China objects, send the gunboats. China objected. Britain sent the gunboats. The First Opium War lasted 2 years. It wasn't a war, it was a massacre. British steam-powered warships destroyed Chinese sailing junks like target practice. Contemporary British accounts describe Chinese ships exploding, sinking in minutes. Thousands of Chinese soldiers dead. British casualties? Minimal. Why? Manufacturing superiority, industrial power, economic strength translated into military dominance. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 forced China to pay 21 million silver dollars, cede Hong Kong, open 5 ports. Accept British merchants and British terms. But it didn't stop there. The Second Opium War, the burning of the Summer Palace. 3,500 British soldiers spent 3 days destroying 800 years of Chinese imperial treasures. The unequal treaties piled up, 23 major treaties, all signed at gunpoint. Then 1900, the Boxer Rebellion. 8 nations invaded China simultaneously: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and yes, the United States. 50,000 foreign troops occupied Beijing. The Boxer Protocol demanded 450 million taels in silver, That's roughly $61 billion in today's money. It equaled 1,300% of China's annual tax revenue. Let me translate that. Imagine the US government being forced to pay $390 trillion in reparations. That's 1,300% of federal revenue, payable over 39 years, with interest. China paid, had no choice. Here's what those 110 years taught Chinese leaders, a lesson burned into national memory. Economic weakness equals national humiliation. Industrial dependence means vulnerability. If you can't make things, you can't defend yourself. If you can't manufacture, you're at the mercy of those who can. That lesson would shape everything that came next. Fast forward to 1978. Mao is dead. China is poor, desperately poor. GDP per capita, about $156. That's not per month, per year. The average Chinese person earned less than 50 cents a day. Deng Xiaoping takes power, and he makes a decision that looks like surrender, but was actually genius. He opens China to Western factories. Now, if you remember the Cold War debates, this seemed like capitalism winning. Western commentators celebrated. China was reforming. China was opening up. The assumption? China would become more like the West. Trade would bring democracy. Factories would bring freedom. Deng had a different plan. He described it himself. Hide your strength, bide your time. That's a direct quote, documented in multiple sources. Deng wasn't hiding his strategy. He announced it. Western analysts just didn't believe him. Here's what Deng understood that Western economists missed. When a Western company builds a factory in China, what actually transfers? Jobs, yes. Wages, yes. But also technology, manufacturing processes, supply chain knowledge, quality control systems, engineering expertise, management techniques, everything. A Chinese worker in a Western factory doesn't just assemble products. They learn how products are made. Chinese engineers don't just follow blueprints. They learn how blueprints are designed. Chinese managers don't just meet quotas. They learn how global supply chains function. Deng's strategy was elegant. Accept Western factories. Learn everything. Build Chinese capability. Wait. The West got cheap labor and fat profit margins. China got the complete knowledge transfer of industrial civilization. And here's what makes this strategic rather than accidental. China required it. Joint ventures with Chinese partners, technology sharing agreements, mandatory training programs. These weren't accidents of negotiation. They were policy. Western companies were so focused on quarterly profits, they didn't notice they were building their own replacement. You watched this transformation with your own eyes. In the 1980s, made in China meant cheap toys, plastic junk, stuff that broke. You probably joked about it. By the 1990s, it meant textiles, shoes, basic electronics. Still low end, still dismissible. Then something shifted. The 2000s hit, and suddenly Made in China was on your computer, your phone, your appliances. Not just assembled there, increasingly designed and engineered there. The numbers tell the story. In 1990, China's share of global manufacturing was about 3%. By 2000, after WTO entry, it climbed to 7%. By 2010, it hit 19%. Today, World Bank and UN industrial data put it at nearly 30%. 30%. China produces almost a third of everything manufactured on Earth. Let me put that in perspective. The United States, at its peak industrial dominance after World War II, never hit 30% of global manufacturing. China did, in your lifetime. But here's what the raw percentages don't capture: the depth of this transformation. China doesn't just make a lot of things. China makes almost everything. Every category, every level of complexity. Name a product, any product. China probably makes it, makes the components for it, makes the machines that make the components, and makes the raw materials that go into the machines. Your iPhone? Assembled in China, obviously. But also, the screen, made in China. The battery, made in China. The circuit boards, made in China. The rare earth elements in the electronics. 60% of global production comes from China. Medical equipment? China produces 40% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients. During the pandemic, this became terrifyingly clear. Western hospitals discovered their supply chains ran through Shenzhen. Solar panels? China controls 80% of global production. Electric vehicle batteries? Over 75%. The entire green energy transition runs through Chinese factories. This didn't happen by accident. This was the plan. Remember Deng's strategy? Accept Western factories. Learn everything. Build capability. The capability got built, systematically, category by category, industry by industry. While Western MBAs optimized for shareholder returns and offshored production, China was building the most complete industrial base in human history. Here's where the reversal becomes clear, and here's where you need to pay attention. Because this is the part Western governments still don't want to admit. For 110 years, China was dependent on Western industrial powers. Couldn't make weapons, couldn't make ships, couldn't make the machines that made machines. That dependence led to humiliation. Now look at the dependency in reverse. When Japan restricted semiconductor material exports to South Korea in 2019, it made global headlines. Supply chain vulnerability exposed, nations scrambling. But Japan's restrictions affected one country and a few products. China's manufacturing position affects everyone and almost everything. During the pandemic, which you lived through, the world discovered how deep this dependency runs. Remember the mask shortage, PPE shortages, ventilator shortages, medical supply shortages? Where did those supplies come from when they finally came? China. Not because China was being generous, because China was the only place that could make them, at scale, quickly. That's not a trade relationship. That's a strategic dependency, and it was engineered. The numbers are stark. According to UN trade data, over 200 product categories have more than 50% of global production concentrated in China. Not just assembled there, primarily manufactured there. Western governments have started using a phrase, supply chain vulnerability. That's a polite way of saying, we can't make things anymore. We outsource too much. We're dependent on a country that remembers what we did to them. Here's the uncomfortable truth, and I'm pulling this from Western analysts, not Chinese sources. Decoupling from China isn't really possible. Not quickly. Maybe not at all. It took 40 years to build this dependency. Building alternative supply chains would take decades. cost trillions. And China isn't standing still. The position they achieved? That's not luck. That's the plan working. But here's what really shows the strategic depth. China isn't content being the factory. They're moving up. The Made in China 2025 plan, announced publicly, you can read it yourself, explicitly targets high-end manufacturing, semiconductors, aerospace, biotechnology, robotics, advanced materials. This isn't hidden. This isn't secret. This is stated Chinese government policy, and they're executing it. High-speed rail. In 2008, China had 0 kilometers of high-speed rail. Today, over 40,000 kilometers, the world's largest network, built in 15 years, with Chinese technology, Chinese engineering, Chinese manufacturing. They didn't just adopt foreign rail technology, they absorbed it, improved it, and now export it. Chinese rail companies are building high-speed lines in Indonesia, Thailand, Africa, South America. Electric vehicles. In 2015, most Western analysts dismissed Chinese EVs as golf carts. Today, BYD outsells Tesla globally. Chinese EV makers are entering European markets. Their battery technology leads the world. 5G telecommunications. Huawei, despite every sanction, every ban, every restriction, remains a global infrastructure leader. They developed their own chips when cut off from American suppliers. Slower chips, but their chips. Space. China has its own space station, its own GPS system, its own lunar exploration program. In 1970, China launched its first satellite. Today, they're planning crewed missions to Mars. This isn't just catching up. This is what a nation does when it spends 110 years watching other countries dominate because of technological superiority. You don't just learn to make things, you learn to make things better. Then you learn to invent new things. The Century of Humiliation taught China that technological dependence is strategic vulnerability. So they're eliminating the dependencies, one industry at a time. You've watched this entire transformation with your own eyes. Nixon's visit, reform and opening, WTO entry, the Beijing Olympics, the manufacturing explosion, the technological rise. In your lifetime, China went from one of the poorest countries on earth to the world's second-largest economy, from a nation humiliated by industrial powers to the world's factory, from making cheap toys to making everything. That wasn't luck. That wasn't accident. That was strategy executed over 40 years. And here's what connects it all, what Western analysis consistently misses. Memory drives policy. When Chinese leaders make decisions about manufacturing, trade, technology, they're not just thinking about quarterly profits or election cycles. They're thinking about 1842, about 1860, about 1900, about 110 years of humiliation that happened because China was industrially weak. That memory is why they accepted Western factories, even when nationalists called it surrender. That memory is why they demanded technology transfer in every deal. That memory is why Made in China 2025 targets strategic industries, not just profitable ones. The West forgets its own history. China doesn't. So here's the uncomfortable truth Western governments won't say publicly, though their own analysts write it in reports. The strategy worked. China took Western capital and Western technology. They learned, they built, they scaled. And when Western governments finally looked up from their cheap consumer goods and fat profit margins, they discovered something uncomfortable. China doesn't just make things for the world. China controls whether things get made. From humiliated to essential, from dependent to indispensable, from vulnerable to strategically positioned. The 55-plus years that you've watched, from the Cold War to now, you've witnessed the most successful economic strategy in human history, executed patiently, methodically, over decades. Your grandchildren will inherit a world where Chinese manufacturing isn't optional, it's structural, where decoupling is a talking point, not a realistic policy. The Century of Humiliation taught China one lesson. Economic weakness equals national vulnerability. They got strong. They accepted Western factories. They learned every skill. They built every capability. They moved up the value chain, and they're not done. That wasn't desperation. That wasn't luck. That was strategy.